A black woman millionaire walks onto her own airline, Undercover, just trying to understand what's going wrong behind the scenes. But the moment she takes her seat in the economy, everything changes. Two passengers behind her start whispering, and what she hears shakes her to the core. Within minutes, she realizes her dream airline, the one she built from nothing, is being quietly dismantled by racism, bias, and betrayal. What happens next sparks a chain reaction no one expected, and forces her to decide whether she'll stay hidden or stand up and fight for everything she believes in. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. It started like any ordinary flight. She rose before the sun, before the noise of the world could disguise itself as peace. In the stillness of her Atlanta penthouse, Evelyn Rhodes stood not as the CEO of Freedom Air, the fastest-growing black-owned airline in America, but as a woman preparing to disappear. Disappearance was not foreign to Evelyn. She'd lived invisibly before, on buses that ran too late through segregated neighborhoods, in boardrooms where her ideas had to be spoken twice, once by her and once by a white man, before they gained legitimacy. She had built something grand, an airline from ashes, a business from doubt. But now, that creation whispered of betrayal. And so, Evelyn Rhodes became Marjorie Ellis. She wore the disguise with reverence, jeans that had no shape, a navy sweater soft with time, and sneakers that had never touched broadloom carpet. Her braids were tucked away beneath a modest wig, her face bare of the armor of power. In the mirror, she greeted her reflection, not with vanity, but with intent. "You're just another black woman flying coach," she whispered, "and they will treat you accordingly." It began as all betrayals do, not with a scream, but with silence. At the airport, she was just another weary traveler in a line that snaked like a story too long to finish. She watched, eyes sharp as razors, as two white passengers with questions received smiles, while a black mother with 3 children was waved off with a gesture barely human. No raised voices. No overt slurs. Just the soft violence of dismissal. Evelyn had been taught all her life that racism didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply chose not to see you. The check-in agent, a woman whose name tag read Tasha, didn't look up when Evelyn approached. "ID," she said. Flat. Distant. Evelyn handed over her forged name and backstory, a biography more believable than truth. The agent frowned at her screen, puzzled. "Say here you were upgraded." She looked up then, suspicious. "Did you pay for this?" "No," Evelyn said calmly. She had told her team, no upgrades, no exceptions. She came to sit in the back, not elevated by the weight of her name. Tasha shrugged. "Figures. System glitch. I'll put you back in 27B. And just like that, Evelyn was reinserted into the machinery. As she moved through security, Evelyn watched a white man in a tailored suit demand priority access. "I fly every week," he barked. The TSA agent, a black woman, held her tone with dignity, but not without fatigue. Evelyn saw the flicker in the man's eyes, the rage of entitlement unmet. She recognized it. She had seen that look when her mother was made to wait for service, when her father was questioned for doing his job too well. She remembered, in America, power resents the presence of those it cannot explain. At the gate, Evelyn sat in silence, surrounded by the quiet rituals of travel. A young black man paced nervously, checked his watch. A Latina mother bounced her child gently on her lap. Nearby, 2 flight attendants whispered behind coffee cups. "They've cut staffing again," one said. "Premium passengers get water first. The rest? Gotta ask." The other nodded. Thompson's orders. Always cutting corners, except for first class. It struck Evelyn then, not just as CEO, but as a black woman, how efficiency was used like a blade. Not to sharpen, but to divide. When boarding was announced, the white business travelers strolled through first, barely acknowledging the staff. Evelyn shuffled along with the rest, economy boarding like cattle to slaughter. She felt the tension around her, not overt, but ambient, like humidity before a storm. She had built the sky, she thought bitterly. But now it refuses to remember her. Seat 27B. The middle. Where no one wants to be. Where discomfort lives on both sides. As she settled in, Evelyn looked around. The flight crew moved through the aisle, some with smiles, some with indifference. And then, as the plane filled, she heard it, the soft tremor of disdain from the row behind her. A woman's voice. "I just don't see why we had to book this airline. I mean, diversity's fine, but shouldn't service matter too?" A man chuckled. "Clients chose it for the optics. Black-owned. Atlanta conference. Makes them look progressive." Evelyn felt the words crawl across her skin like ants. The man continued, quieter now, but no less sharp. "That attendant practically ignored us. But all smiles for the black passengers." A pause. "Reverse discrimination, I guess." Another chuckle. "Ironic, isn't it?" She gripped the armrests. Her kingdom was rotting from within. And yet, what cut deepest wasn't the prejudice. It was the casualness of it. The ease. The comfort they felt in speaking such words in public, not knowing or not caring that the woman in front of them, the one they dismissed with their glances, had built the very wings carrying them skyward. This was just the beginning. And Evelyn knew, in order to save her company, she had to face a truth older than the airplane itself, that in America, even the sky is segregated, if you know where to look. The next morning arrived not with clarity, but with the weight of unspoken truths. Evelyn Rhodes, still masked as Marjorie Ellis, woke in a modest Chicago hotel room where the wallpaper peeled like forgotten promises. The night before had been long. Not because of turbulence in the skies, but because of what she had overheard, what she had felt, a slow violence, too familiar to be shocking. Her mother used to say, "Baby, racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a smile and a name tag." And now Evelyn understood why her body felt bruised, even though no hand had touched her. She dressed again in disguise, though she was beginning to see it wasn't much of one. For a black woman, invisibility is never about clothing. It's about how the world chooses to see you, or not see you at all. At the airport, the check-in line for Freedom Air wrapped like a serpent around its own frustration. Only 2 attendants worked the counter, even though it was peak time. She noticed a young black family struggling under the weight of strollers, backpacks, and infant tears. The father, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, pleaded with the agent. "We flew here with 3 bags. No extra charge." The agent, blonde, young, unmoved, replied, "That must have been a mistake. It's $75 today. Company policy." Evelyn's lips tightened. She wrote that policy. And she had written it without that fee, specifically to accommodate families, especially black families, who were already balancing more than bags. She watched as the man reluctantly handed over his card. No protest. Just weariness. The kind that had been passed down, generation to generation. Not a learned helplessness, but a strategic surrender. Because sometimes, to resist is to risk too much. When Evelyn reached the desk, the agent didn't look up. Confirmation number? No eye contact. No warmth. No smile. "I'm fine with any seat," Evelyn said. "You've been placed in 14A. Window." The boarding pass was handed over like change from a register, mechanical, impersonal. Evelyn made a mental note. If a name and a face could shift the way a black woman was treated, then what of those who couldn't afford either? What of those without titles to shield them? At security, it worsened. The TSA pre-check line, something Evelyn had fought hard for her airline to participate in, was closed. Everyone was funneled into the same snaking line. The air grew thick with impatience. A white businessman behind her muttered to his colleague, "I knew I should have flown to America." This black-owned startup's always cutting corners. Evelyn turned slightly, catching his eye. He didn't flinch. In fact, he smiled politely, the way one does when excusing themselves from accountability. That smile, how many times had it been used to decorate cruelty? By the time she reached her gate, chaos had replaced order. The boarding process was a storm without thunder, confused lines, agitated passengers, and the staff stretched thin. A gate agent snapped at an elderly black man who asked for assistance. "Sir, I don't have time." "You'll have to wait." Moments later, a white woman approached, asking the same question. The agent smiled. "Of course, ma'am. Let me help you right away." The contradiction stung. Evelyn boarded in silence, the sting not from what was said, but from what was consistently allowed. Her seat was 14A. The cabin was unkempt. Trash still lingered from a previous flight. The tray table was sticky. Her seatmate, a young white woman, put in earbuds without so much as a nod. Evelyn wasn't offended. She was used to being rendered in the background. An older black woman filled the aisle seat last minute, breathless. "Few made it." "Didn't think I would," she said to no one in particular. Evelyn nodded politely. A shared glance, one that held volumes. They see us and they don't. They serve us, but not equally. Once airborne, the service cart inched its way down the aisle. When it finally arrived, the attendant, an Asian woman named Lynn, spoke without looking up. "Drink?" Evelyn asked for coffee. "No napkin. No cream. Just a lukewarm insult in a paper cup." She remembered a line from her father, "They'll serve you, but they won't serve you with soul." Mid-flight, Evelyn moved toward the back, ostensibly for the restroom. What she found instead were two flight attendants whispering near the galley. "These surveys are a joke," one said. "They only count premium customers now. The rest of us? Invisible," said the other. "Thompson's metrics are setting us up to fail." "And Mitchell?" "She's probably off giving another speech about black excellence." They didn't know she was standing just around the corner. It wasn't just about Thompson anymore. It was about how easily people could turn against the dream once it stopped being new. How black leadership was celebrated until it became inconvenient. How excellence was only appreciated if it didn't ask for equity. Back at her seat, Evelyn felt the hum of the aircraft echo the tension in her chest. The illusion was breaking. Not just of the airline, but of the America she had hoped to model through it. She looked out the window, watching clouds drift like unanswered prayers. The world hadn't changed. It had only gotten better at hiding. And so, she thought to herself, they want a black face on the brochure, not in the boardroom. They want diversity without discomfort. Representation without reparation. But she wasn't here to make them comfortable. She was here to remember what they had forgotten, that every seat in that plane, whether window or aisle, was paid for with something. Some paid in dollars. Others paid in silence. And Evelyn Rhodes had paid in both. By the time Evelyn landed back in Atlanta, the city greeted her not with warmth, but with indifference. The kind of indifference that is more dangerous than rage, because it is patient. Because it waits for you to exhaust yourself before it moves in to remind you. You are still black, still woman, still alone. She chose not to go home. Not yet. She needed distance, not from the city, but from herself, from the part of her that once believed proximity to power would soften its bite. So instead, she made her way to Terminal B, to the lesser gates where Freedom Air operated short-haul flights to cities forgotten by first-class travelers. Memphis, Birmingham, Tallahassee. Cities like the one she came from. Cities where folks didn't fly for luxury. They flew to live, to work, to bury their dead. The check-in counters were underlit. The Freedom Air sign above them flickered like a tired eye. Only one attendant stood behind the desk, fending off a sea of frustration. The line stretched far beyond the stanchions, mostly black and brown passengers, shifting their weight, watching the clock. A black father in a faded suit, holding a wriggling toddler, stepped up. "3 of us are flying. We checked 3 bags coming here, no issue." The attendant, barely 20, pale and pinched in the mouth, replied with bureaucratic certainty. That would have been an exception. The policies changed. Evelyn stepped aside and scribbled in her notepad. Change when? Change for whom? Moments later, a white woman with a rolling suitcase the size of Georgia approached with a question about a missed connection. The attendant's face lit up, suddenly kind, suddenly capable of empathy. "Oh yes, ma'am. Let me rebook you right away." And there it was again. Not in the yelling. Not in slurs. but in the modulation of tone, the reallocation of courtesy. Racism had grown up. It had learned not to raise its voice. It had learned to smile while breaking your back. Later, Evelyn boarded another flight, this time to Dallas. It was not the route that mattered. It was what she'd see, what she'd feel, and what she'd be forced to confront. The aircraft was cleaner, the crew more polished. The lead attendant, Gerald, an older black man with a quiet dignity, welcomed her aboard with a smile that didn't need to prove itself. This, she thought, is what it was supposed to be. As the flight leveled above the clouds, Evelyn moved quietly to the galley. Gerald stood there alone, reviewing a checklist with the precision of a man who knew what it cost to get things exactly right. "Great service today," she said casually. He looked up. "Thank you, ma'am. We try to do it right." Evelyn leaned in slightly. It felt different. From this morning's flight, Gerald's eyes darkened, just for a moment. "Every flight is unique," he replied, diplomatically. "But some are more equal than others?" she asked, echoing a line she once read. He smiled, but there was no joy in it. "There's the freedom air you see in the commercials. And then there's the one that shows up to work." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And what changed?" Gerald exhaled. "Thompson. Corporations started pushing this efficiency model. On paper it looks like progress. But in the aisles, it looks like fewer staff, less training, and customers divided into two categories, those worth impressing and those who should feel grateful just to be on the plane." Evelyn's voice dropped. "And which ones get which treatment?" He looked at her, finally, fully. "You already know the answer to that." She did. What gnawed at her wasn't that injustice existed, that was a given. It was how easily it slipped in when no one was watching. How betrayal dressed itself in strategy and got signed off by boards and shareholders. And how, somewhere along the way, even the people who looked like her started to doubt that excellence could exist without apology. That evening, Evelyn sat alone in her hotel room, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. She began compiling her notes, her observations, her evidence, as though she were preparing for trial. Because, in a way, she was. Only this trial had no jury. Just a silent America, watching from its living rooms, deciding whether her rage was professional, whether her disappointment was data-driven, whether her very presence in that executive chair was earned, or simply part of the diversity agenda. She stared at her reflection in the black screen, no longer Veronica Ellis, not yet Evelyn Rhodes in full. Just a woman, worn from flying, furious from seeing too clearly. She whispered, "They don't want me to succeed. They just want to say they hired me." That night, she didn't sleep. She watched the sky darken and the airport lights flicker from her window, wondering how many people had been asked to dim themselves just to be allowed on board. Tomorrow would bring more flights, more facades, more fault lines. But tonight, she sat with the truth. Not the kind found in spreadsheets, but the kind that could only be heard if you listened closely, like the subtle shift in a stewardess voice, or the quiet despair in a father's sigh, or the question in Gerald's tired smile, "Are you still who you said you were?" And Evelyn knew there would be no peace until she could answer, yes. By the time Evelyn stepped into the small terminal at Dallas Love Field, she could feel the weight of compromise hanging in the air like humidity. The walls were yellowed from time, the signage still bearing Freedom Air's old branding, unupdated, unimportant. Forgotten, like the people this terminal served. This was where you learned the real meaning of efficiency. Not the kind that improves, but the kind that erases. Here, Evelyn wasn't undercover anymore. She was underneath something. Beneath the polish, the promises, the press releases. Beneath the executive briefings that never made it this far south. A line snaked across the terminal, filled with working folks. People with overnight bags and no room for error. A black businessman in a crisp navy suit was calmly pressing the gate agent for information on a delayed flight. "I have back-to-back meetings in Memphis. I just need to know, will this flight depart today?" The agent, a young white woman with a headset that served more as armor than tool, let out a breath sharp enough to slice. "Sir, as I've explained, I do not have that information." Then came the next passenger, a white woman, maybe mid-50s, with a designer tote and an accent that said, "I expect to be heard." "Excuse me, I have a connection in Nashville." Evelyn watched the agent's face shift. The clipped edges softened. "Let me check your options right away, ma'am." There it was again. That same American ritual. Not in fire hoses, not in slurs. But patience rationed out based on skin. In hospitality offered selectively, like a private club. Evelyn moved toward another gate, one bound for New Orleans. Boarding had just begun. She saw it all over again. The premium passengers, mostly white, received smiles, questions about their destination, a warm, "enjoy your flight." The rest, black families, young mothers with children, elderly men with tired eyes, were shuffled through like parcels, stamped and shelved. She wrote down a phrase in her notebook. Customer service depends on the color of the customer. This was not Southern hospitality. This was systemic etiquette, the learned behavior of institutions designed to recognize some and endure others. At that moment, Evelyn felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned. Gerald stood there, dressed in his flight uniform, eyes sharp and watchful. "Miss Ellis," he said, subtly stressing the false name. "I didn't expect to see you here," she replied. "You asked for an honest crew," he said. "Well, we don't clock out when we land." He gestured for her to walk with him down a quiet hallway. "Operations here? It's what we call a secondary priority station. We get the least staff, the lowest pay scale, and trainees straight out of orientation. And we're graded not on customer satisfaction, but on how fast we can shut the door. Even if that means shutting it on someone's dignity?" Evelyn asked. Gerald's silence was answer enough. He continued, "They call it resource-efficient staffing. But when you look at which routes get deprioritized, a pattern shows up, clear as day. Routes to Black communities. To working-class towns. To anywhere that doesn't look like the inside of a boardroom." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "So they're building 2 airlines. One for those who matter. One for those who don't. And painting them the same color to make it all look equal," Gerald said. They stopped by a window. Outside, an old Freedom Air jet sat on the tarmac, its logo peeling, its belly open for loading. "Racism," Gerald said softly, "isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a delayed flight. A rushed greeting. A coffee cup with no lid. Sometimes it's a policy that nobody questions because it sounds reasonable." Evelyn stared at the plane. She thought about her mother, who taught algebra and wore Sunday gloves to fly. She thought about her father, a mechanic, who told her, "Airplanes don't lie, but the people who build them might." She looked back at Gerald. "They're gambling that we won't notice. That will settle." Gerald smiled sadly. "They always do." That night, Evelyn returned to her hotel and opened her laptop with shaking hands. The screen glowed with every contraction she'd been collecting. Photos. Memos. Notes. But none of it captured the slow violence of watching people become invisible. She thought about the faces in that terminal. Faces that deserved more than efficiency. More than performance metrics. Faces that deserved to be seen. She whispered to herself, not as Evelyn Rhodes the CO, not as Veronica Ellis the passenger, but as the child of people who taught her to fight with both heart and mind. "They taught me that my blackness wasn't a burden. It was a banner. And I won't let them fold it into silence. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. It would bring risk. But tonight, Evelyn allowed herself a quiet truth. Justice does not always shout. Sometimes it boards a flight in silence, but it always reaches its destination." By the 5th day, Evelyn was no longer documenting incidents. She was collecting evidence of erosion. Not of the airline alone, but of a promise. A dream. The very idea that a Black woman could build something that would be different, and that difference would last. She sat alone in a quiet corner of the Dallas airport, sipping a bitter coffee and reviewing what she had found. The flash drive from Tiana had revealed more than misconduct. It was a blueprint for betrayal. Policy changes signed with her name, but never her hand. Numbers altered. Metrics bent. Truth, distorted through spreadsheets like a funhouse mirror. And still, somewhere in the boardroom, someone would say, but the profits are up. You see, the great American contradiction is this. They ask us to achieve, but once we do, they question how we got there. They praise your hustle, then whisper about how far you've come, as though that distance should humble you into silence. But Evelyn had never been silent. Not when the bank said no. Not when the industry laughed. And certainly not now. That morning, her inbox lit up with a headline. Ascension faces backlash over viral video alleging racial bias at gate. A black man, platinum member, denied priority boarding, while 2 white passengers with the same status were waved through. The video was short, grainy, but damning. The hashtag Ascension discrimination was spreading faster than the company's last ad campaign. And what did the corporation say? Isolated incident. Under investigation. That phrase stung Evelyn more than she could admit. Because racism in America never announces itself, it arrives in fragments. In isolation. One moment at a time. One decision. One denial. One delay. And those fragments, collected long enough, build a wall. Evelyn called Marcus. He said it wasn't serious, Marcus told her, his voice tight. Who? Thompson. He said we didn't need to inform you. That legal would handle it quietly. There it was. The final insult. The erasure not only of her authority, but of her intent. The airline was built on a foundation of equity, and now it was being hollowed from the inside, paved over with efficiency and optics. Evelyn's hand trembled as she opened a hidden dashboard, one she'd coded herself during Ascension's early days. And what she saw broke her. The reports sent to the board showed modest gains. But the raw data told the real story. Complaints up. Staff morale down. Satisfaction among economy passengers, particularly black and brown travelers, had plummeted. Staffing cuts aligned almost perfectly with routes to black-majority cities. It was not a coincidence. It was not an oversight. It was design. She sat there, laptop glowing in the dim light, the airport hum whispering around her like ghosts. She thought about her mother again, who used to tell her, "Don't let the numbers tell the story alone. Ask who's counting." Now Evelyn understood. Richard Thompson had turned her dream into a 2-tiered machine. Not only was service uneven, but the silence was weaponized. The very structure of reporting had been warped to erase the pain. This wasn't just bad management. This was mathematical racism, discrimination dressed in formulas, hidden behind pivot tables, and laundered through executive summaries. She picked up the phone again. Not to call Marcus, but Tiana. "I need to meet tonight," she said. "I already booked a room near your hotel," Tiana replied, without hesitation. "I'll bring everything. You need to see what's next." Evelyn stared at the gate in front of her, families lining up for boarding. A black woman holding a child, trying to soothe her baby while digging for her boarding pass. The agent waved her forward impatiently, already turning to the next name. No eye contact. No greeting. No dignity. This is the America Baldwin warned about. Not the burning crosses, but the clipped tones, the glances withheld, the service denied not by law, but by indifference. A quiet violence practiced every day in the name of procedure. And so Evelyn knew. This wasn't just about reclaiming a company. It was about reminding them that dignity is not a luxury. It is not tied to your zip code, or your skin, or your boarding group. It is a birthright. And she was ready to fight for it. The room was dim, the glow of Evelyn's laptop flickering against the cheap hotel wallpaper. Outside, the Dallas rain tapped the window like a quiet warning. But inside, thunder was gathering. Tiana sat across from her, young, but not naive. In her eyes, Evelyn saw the reflection of a younger self, wide-eyed, clear-hearted, and still foolish enough to believe that excellence would be enough. That if you worked harder, were kinder, sharper, twice as prepared, the world would meet you halfway. Tiana placed a flash drive on the table. "Everything," she said. "Emails. Meeting notes. Training memos they never meant for you to see." Evelyn slid it into her computer. What poured onto the screen wasn't just evidence, it was indictment. Policy drafts marked alternate tiering strategy, code for reassigning resources away from black majority routes. Internal surveys filtered to hide negative feedback from economy class, feedback written in voices she recognized. A grandmother from Birmingham, a school teacher from Newark, a retired Army veteran from Baton Rouge. Then came the staffing memos, crew rotations manipulated to favor visibility markets, with majority white flyers. That's where the polished, well-trained staff went. The rest? Understaffed, underprepared, undervalued. Richard Thompson is planning a full restructure, Tiana said. 2 airlines. One for them. One for the rest of us. That line lingered in the air like smoke. One for them. One for the rest of us. It was not new. It echoed through school doors, hospital hallways, bank counters, and bus stops. It had been redlined into city maps, baked into zoning laws, and whispered in hiring decisions. And now it was boarding planes, seat by seat. The next morning, Evelyn flew again, her last flight before the reckoning. She boarded as Veronica Miller, but she was no longer undercover. She was a witness. The terminal at Dallas Love Field was a study in abandonment. Outdated signs. Long lines. An overwhelmed gate agent barking at passengers with no time for decency. Evelyn watched a black family be told their flight was overbooked, offered a $75 voucher, and a hotel with a broken elevator. 10 minutes later, a white businessman complained of a tight connection and was upgraded to first class. Not because he asked differently, but because the agent heard him differently. The difference, as always, was not just in the answer. It was in the expectation of who deserves what. On the flight to Atlanta, the air was thick with unspoken truths. Evelyn sat next to a young Latina woman struggling to manage her toddler, ignored by the flight attendants. A row ahead, a white couple received free snacks and extra blankets. No one raised their voice. No one cursed. That's not how it works. Racism, now, wears a necktie and holds a clipboard. It doesn't shout, it smiles. It documents. It calls itself policy and claims it's colorblind, even while its eyes refuse to meet yours. Halfway through the flight, Gerald, the lead flight attendant from her earlier trip, approached subtly and handed her a folded note. Thompson will be at HQ when you land. Security is briefed. Marcus has the board ready. They're waiting for you. Evelyn nodded, not looking up. She was not ready, not yet. Because she wasn't just going to fire a man. She was going to put the entire system on trial. As they descended, she stared out the window. Atlanta's skyline blinked beneath them, and she remembered her mother's voice, reading Baldwin aloud at the kitchen table. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. But this rage Evelyn had refined. She had sharpened it into vision. And now she would turn it into action. Because what she'd uncovered wasn't just a betrayal of her company. It was a betrayal of her people. And in America, the most dangerous thing you can do as a Black woman is to remember that your dream was never meant to be small. There is a peculiar violence in the silence of men who believe themselves to be civilized. They wear it like a tailored suit, pressed, polished, and deadly in its precision. Evelyn Monroe walked into that silence. The boardroom at Ascendant Airways was all glass and leather, gleaming like justice, but cold as indifference. The men, yes, mostly men, looked up from their conference packets with polite confusion. And at the head of the table stood Richard Thompson, unbothered, rehearsed, armed with metrics and smiles. "Evelyn," he said, as if she'd come to fetch coffee, not burn the table down. She didn't sit. She stood, as her ancestors had stood when the courtroom offered no defense, when the church pew whispered segregation, when the lunch counter said you don't belong here. She stood for the unspoken. "I've flown," she said, her voice low but unwavering as someone beneath your spreadsheets. "I've sat in row 26, seat C. I've been ignored, dismissed, and made to feel invisible on planes I built." Thompson scoffed quietly, but she didn't pause. "I've listened to passengers who believe that skin color dictates service quality. I've watched as our crews were divided, some groomed for premium routes, others tossed to the corners of the map." A long silence followed. And then, as they always do, the defenders of the status quo cleared their throats. "Let's not turn this into a political thing," said one board member, white, mid-60s, ex-military, the kind who said, "I don't see race, but saw it in everything." Another added, "You can't prove intention, Evelyn. Maybe these outcomes are unfortunate, but they're just data anomalies." Anomalies, she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "You mean how Black passengers receive 40% more delays on our secondary routes? Or how crew satisfaction plummets on flights to predominantly Black cities, but you didn't bother asking why?" She placed the folder on the table. Inside, Tiana's drive. Gerald's testimony. Screenshots. Forged approvals. Manipulated reports. Receipts, as the young folks would say. And then came the final blow, the one they couldn't deflect. "Mr. Thompson," she said, turning toward him, "you signed off on staffing cuts that violated FAA regulations. You prioritized white-majority markets while gutting service elsewhere. And worse, you forged my digital signature." The room shifted. No longer polite. "Now I'm anxious." Because power never panics until it's cornered. Thompson stepped forward, voice rising. "This is business, Evelyn. Not activism. I made this airline profitable." "No," she replied, calm like a preacher before the sermon. "You made it profitable for some. You made it a prison for others." He laughed then, a brittle, terrified thing. "You want to run a charity? Be my guest. But don't pretend equality and success can live in the same sentence." At that, Evelyn finally sat. And with the grace of every woman who's ever been told she was too loud, too Black, too much, she said, "They already do. I am both." The vote was unanimous. Richard Thompson was escorted out, his tailored suit still crisp, but his empire unraveling behind him. As the doors closed, Evelyn addressed the board once more. "I didn't come to reclaim my title," she said. "I came to remind you what it meant. Ascendant was never built for comfort. It was built to rise. Not just in altitude, but in truth." Outside the boardroom, the staff stood in quiet rows. When they saw her, some clapped. Others simply nodded, subtle gestures from tired hands. From people who knew what it meant to hope quietly. Because the truth is, in America, dignity isn't given. It's fought for. And that evening, in a glass tower built on illusion, Evelyn Monroe did not just win a seat back. She shattered the mirror of polite racism and forced everyone inside to look. The hardest part of any reckoning is not the moment of truth, but the quiet that follows. It was the stillness after Thompson's departure, the echo of his expensive shoes down a hallway he'd never returned through, that brought Evelyn Monroe to the window. She stood alone, watching the city lights blink like old ghosts over Atlanta. Somewhere out there, planes were cutting through the dark sky, some clean, some cracked. All carrying people who still believe service was colorblind, or who had stopped believing long ago. But now she knew, leadership isn't a speech. It's what you choose to see when it would be easier to look away. 3 days later, Evelyn boarded a flight to Baltimore, no disguise this time. No Veronica Miller, no wig, no silence. Just herself. Seat 32B. As she moved through the cabin, passengers looked up, some in recognition, others in mild curiosity. The whispers came in hushed tones. "Is that the CEO? She's flying back here?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Let them watch." She sat beside an elderly Black man who didn't say much at first. He nodded, tipped his cap, and went back to his crossword. The woman in the window seat glanced between them and quickly turned toward the glass. Service was slower on this route. The cabin was worn. The crew was overworked. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in the way the young flight attendant, a girl with tight coils pulled into a bun, offered water to a mother wrestling with 2 children. That's where Evelyn saw the fight. Not in boardrooms. Not in data dashboards. But in every simple act that said, "You matter too." An hour into the flight, turbulence struck. A rough patch, sharp and sudden. Trays rattled. People gasped. And Evelyn noticed something old. Fear doesn't discriminate, but how we respond to it often does. As the plane bucked, a white man too rose ahead, demanded attention from the flight crew, raising his voice, gesturing at the black flight attendant who was helping an elderly woman fasten her seatbelt. "I need help here," he barked. The attendant nodded, firm but calm. "Sir, I'll be with you in one moment." "That's unacceptable. I'm a platinum flyer." The words sat heavy in the cabin, soaked in entitlement. Evelyn leaned forward just slightly, not to interfere, but to witness. To remember. The flight attendant returned to her jump seat as the turbulence passed. When it cleared, she stood and walked straight to the man. "Thank you for your patience," she said simply. No sarcasm, just grace. He looked away. Later, the man beside Evelyn spoke. His voice was soft, seasoned with southern wind. "People forget who built these skies," he said, still looking at his crossword. "Forget who stitched the uniforms, cleaned the cabins, flew through storms when no one else would." Evelyn nodded. "Or who fought to be seen at all." He turned to her then. "You her, ain't you? The woman who started all this." She hesitated, then smiled. "I am." He nodded again, satisfied. "Glad you came back down to earth. Lot of folks get too high and forget what turbulence feels like." "I needed to feel it again," she said. When they landed, the applause was sparse, but real. Not for a smooth landing, but for a shift. Something had changed. Not everything. Not yet. But something. As she stepped off the plane, Evelyn was met not by fanfare, but by her staff, Gerald, Tiana, others who had risked comfort for conscience. They didn't say much. But they didn't need to. In that silence was solidarity. Weeks later, policies were rewritten. Not to be performative, but restorative. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Hiring shifted from pedigree to purpose. Bonuses were tied not just to revenue, but to respect. And Evelyn? She returned to the skies monthly. Not for photo ops, but to stay grounded. Because once you've heard the truth whispered behind your back, you never forget the sound. Closing. To those still listening, especially those who've lived long enough to see progress repeat itself in circles, know this. Racism does not always shout. It whispers. It suggests. It structures itself into polite policies and calls them merit. It hides in the design of the cabin, the language of service, the silence of leaders. But the air, like the truth, has a way of getting in. Evelyn Monroe didn't save a company. She reminded it who it was always meant to be. And perhaps, in doing so, reminded us all that the journey toward justice may begin at 38,000 feet, but it lands every day.